Many video games have interesting stories behind them, stories which have been told many times over the years by people who are passionate about them. Stories that tell a tale about the people who developed them and the work which went into them. And it's stories like these that help keep games alive and interest a new generation who may not have been exposed to them. Today, I'm going to be talking about GeneRally, or GeneRally depending on who you ask, a freeware top-down racing game which, thanks to its extremely dedicated community, developed infinite replay value and a notoriety that games developed on a much bigger budget could only have dreamt of. It all started in 2001, when a pair of Finnish brothers from the city of Jyväskylä, Hannu and Jukka Rabiner, got together to try and make what was then a modern reinterpretation of one of their favourite gaming memories from their childhood, Slicks and Slide, also developed by the compatriot Kauppanen brothers a decade prior, and which in itself was a clone of Atari's famed 1986 title Super Sprint. What these two aforementioned titles had in common is that they both took the general concept of racing and turned it into something of an idealised microcosm. Track proportions were distorted to provide plenty of runoff, with extra wide corners, diminutive proportions, and large, flat straights which catered to players of all difficulty levels. The sensation of driving a serious race car was whittled down into its base components, and yet it remained very fun, even in the face of serious simulation titles which grew ever closer to real life. But what set Slicks and Slide apart from its predecessors was the fact it was bundled with its own track editor, which allowed many people to make their own tracks and put them up for download during the early days of the internet. Digital Footmark, who represent the title's original development team, has even helped to archive over 400 of these from personal collections made in the 1990s, although the real number is probably much higher but unfortunately lost to time. But despite the game's relative obscurity outside of its native Finland, the fact that anyone with zero programming knowledge could add to the base game with their own special contribution helped to maintain interest in the game long after its initial release, and the Rabiner brothers wanted to see if they could build upon the Kauppanen's success and make a new game that was essentially a sequel in all but name. They would title this project GeneRally, as a pun on the English word generally, and the journey in which this game would take in the following years certainly far exceeded their initial expectations by a factor of several thousand. According to an interview conducted by James Burgess in September 2002, the only known interview of the two brothers, the idea for GeneRally came about in the summer of 2001, when Jukka Rabiner was unable to find a job and needed something to occupy his time. He had developed some 2D racing games in the past, but these were less arcade in nature and difficult to play. His brother Hannu was enthralled with the idea and soon joined him in his endeavours, with the pair deciding to work together. The game would enter development sometime during the second half of that year, as can be gleaned from the README file for the May 2002 beta release. To that end, there is a single screenshot bundled within that version's documentation, which is dated to the 14th of September 2001. If this date is indeed legitimate, it would mean that GeneRally was in development for at least 10 months in total, likely in an on and off capacity as the Rabiners tended to real-life obligations, such as Jukka's studies at the University of Jyväskylä. Unfortunately, there really just isn't much to go on outside of this interview, as I cannot find any other contemporary media involving the pair who have otherwise led very sedentary lives since then, partaking in extreme sports such as mountain biking and rock climbing. Regardless, as the game slowly took shape, the pair made sure to preserve as much of the core gameplay they had enjoyed from Slicks and Slide as possible, but with an extra third-dimensional twist, which allowed vehicular control to be that more precise. A crucial element behind GeneRally's gameplay was that it had to be easy for any player to get to grips with, not just those already well acquainted with top-down arcade races. There were also some other unique stylistic choices made by the Rabiners which helped make the game unique and instill it with its own character. Along with the game's bright, limited colour palette, its simple and addictive gameplay, and trademarked spherical wheels, perhaps the most important is the game's hard-coded limitation of no more than 40 polygons for cars, with just 30 vertices to play with. To give an idea of just how low that is, most default vehicles in Midtown Madness 2 hover around the 1000 polygon mark. Stunts, often considered the grandfather of the modern racing game due to its wide variety of features it helped to pioneer, limited its models to having no more than 256 polygons, a quarter of MM2s. GeneRally's, on the other hand, at just 40 polygons, mean they are 6 times less complex than those from a game made in 1990. Continuing on with the story, the Rabiner brothers would publicly release the first beta of the game on the 16th of May 2002. At this point, the game was very basic, lacking even a track editor, and was more a demonstration of the game's capabilities. A website would be set up on Finnish web hosting service MBNet, though within a matter of weeks its traffic demands would outstrip the host's capabilities, and would move to a more permanent host in the form of CJB, which is where the game would reside for the majority of the year. Early reception to the beta was overwhelmingly positive, and upon the game's full release in July 2002, it was decided to include a track editor, as well as the two brothers launching a forum, with hosting duties split between their personal site and M4Driving.sm, an Italian virtual racing community based in San Marino. This forum allowed users to give the creators direct feedback, so they could gradually fix the game's bugs and develop later versions. Unusually for a forum of this age and relative obscurity, much of it has been preserved within the Wayback Machine, which has allowed me to piece the story of the game's first year together. In anticipation of fans creating their own tracks and wishing to share them with the world, the Rabiners would also launch the very first track database. Thanks to the work of aptly named German community member Chrono, all of these tracks were backed up, and although the name of who designed them has been lost to time, not even 24 hours would pass following the release of version 1.0 before the first 3 verifiable new tracks were created and released, the first of these being a circuit track called U-Race. In the beginning, members had to email their tracks directly to the Rabiner brothers themselves, but eventually this process would be automated and streamlined. Within weeks, word of the game spread across the internet like wildfire. People were coming across the game through all sorts of places. Finnish players who were previously enamoured with Slicks and Slide quickly took to GeneRally. As the Rabiner brothers had anticipated, soon the game attracted far more than just Finns, as it would regularly top the charts across many international freeware sites, and was even featured in several gaming magazine discs of the era, further broadening its popularity. But there was one website in particular which catapulted the game into virtual superstardom, Home of the Underdogs. This website, created by Thai journalist Sarani Achivanuntakul in 1998, was founded upon the concepts of abandonware and freeware after Sarani struggled to find a replacement copy of Sword of the Samurai, an older title she had enjoyed but was out of print, and within a short period of time her site quickly became a prominent name within the online gaming community, which was primarily frequented by two types of people: veterans who had grown up playing these older games, and younger people such as myself who didn't have the best hardware and couldn't buy anything online. Websites such as these were a boon to independent game developers in the days before platforms such as Steam launched, as it promoted their work and distributed it towards loyal audiences. Part of GeneRally's massive appeal from early on was its retro-inspired design, which was targeted at some of the slower PCs of the era. Due to its exceptionally low polygon count, simple shaders, complete lack of environmental effects, and other optimization techniques, the game could run well on a Pentium 120 running Windows 95, a computer and operating system which were 7 years old at the time. Another aspect in which the game remained virtually unparalleled was its language support. By October 2002, GeneRally already supported 20 different languages. Alongside its default English and Finnish, the game included support for Swedish, Norwegian, Estonian, Slovenian, Galician, Turkish, both major dialects of Portuguese, and even Welsh, just to name a few. With a young, fledgling community releasing tracks by the hundreds, the desire to mod increased, particularly when all these tracks could only be driven by just a handful of cars. Though the idea was initially met with some reticence, some members harboured the desire to have a go at making their own vehicles from scratch. The first to succeed in this endeavour would be Asa Heimelin, better known by his on-screen alias Jazza, who would produce a very primitive car editor using a Microsoft Excel database. With it, he was able to produce the game's first 3 new cars not made by the Rabiner brothers, the Limo Evo, Helkuti, and Jazzmobile, which he would release together on the 26th of July 2002. This did not go over well with Hannu Rabiner, who didn't intend for new cars to be added, but in order for the game to grow, this more or less became a necessity. This would prompt another member of the community, Stephen Dawkins, alias El Farto, to commence development on his own car editor, which he would release just 5 days later. As attempts to protect the file format seemed futile in the name of creativity, Hannu would publicly disclose the format later that day, opening the floodgates for others to follow in Heimelin's footsteps. A small game of hot potato would ensue, with Dawkins releasing several updates to his car editor throughout August 2002, before ceding control of the project to a man who more than made his mark on the gaming community, Rich Weeds Nagel. Familiar to many as the producer of the soundtrack to the Doom expansion mods TNT Evolution, among many other credits, Nagel would continue development on a car editor which had a 3D view but did not have a tool which could compile the program, so sent his project to Justin Parker, known by his pseudonym Lawn Gnome. Parker had twice attempted to produce the first new car for the game, starting off with a 49 polygon motorcycle before tightening down to a 20 polygon car, which also had 60 vertices. Unsurprisingly, neither of these worked, due to the game's hard-coded 40 polygon 30 vertex limit, but it showed that there was significant interest in the idea. Finally, on the 20th of September, Jim Belshaw, better known by his online alias Strava and a man whose impact on the Prix Legends community remains appreciated to this day, would commence development on a final car editor, which allowed for the manual placement of the wheels and helmet, an aspect which earlier editors lacked. He would produce a concise tutorial on how to make a new car for GeneRally before releasing his first few new cars of the game, his finalised car editor, and the necessary documentation on how to use it during the following week. Months later, these tools would be further improved upon by Juan, another renowned member of the GR community whose tools are still used to this very day. Finally, the game could begin to expand. And expand it did. By late 2002, 1,000 tracks had already been publicly released on the first iteration of the track database. By the time it was shut down for new submissions in January 2003, that number had blown to more than 2,000. In regards to new cars and other add-ons, many different websites would be set up in order to host them, a handful of which have survived the test of time. What's amazing is the sheer diversity of these websites in terms of nationality. There wasn't a corner of the world that wasn't represented. Above all else, it was clear that GeneRally had grown far beyond what the Rabiner brothers had originally intended, and it needed to move to bigger, greener pastures. Enter Race Sim Central. The website was established in late 2001 when its original founder, Tim Wheatley, who had originally created the website as Legends Central for Papyrus's 2 classic-themed racing simulator titles, could no longer financially support the website, handing control to the administration team of what was once Denmark's largest sim racing scene, simracing.dk, under whom the website officially merged during the next year or so. Needless to say, Race Sim Central quickly ballooned into becoming the premier website for discussing racing simulators, in addition to becoming a new home for many communities which were previously estranged. Throughout the majority of the 2000s, Race Sim Central was the central hub for virtual racing. It's hard to describe just how big this website was by modern standards, where everything has since splintered back off into smaller, specialised communities through services such as Discord, for instance, but during its heyday, it was absolutely massive on an unparalleled scale, as it not only covered news on the latest titles, but served as unofficial support forums along with being the face of many different modding communities, and unfortunately, it would be the sheer scale which would later prove to be the website's undoing. GeneRally's inclusion on Race Sim Central was an odd one, as the game possessed zero simulation qualities. What's even more surprising, however, is that the game never lost its immediate appeal, and with a permanent base now firmly established, the game could only grow upwards and outwards. Traditionally, a major feature of all successful racing games on the PC hinged on their online capabilities. However, since GeneRally was never designed with an online play feature, players had to get creative in order to compete against one another. From the game's inception, there were various hot lap events where drivers would send the event organiser their fastest time, along with a forum thread which kept record of drivers who held the fastest laps at each of the default circuits. BG Catfan, otherwise known as renowned speedcuber and racing simulator enthusiast Chris Albrecht, would stage what is believed to be the very first GeneRally tournament at the beginning of October 2002. Instead of head-to-head racing, players would be rated using a similar hot lap system as that which already existed, and their performance would be measured across several races instead of just one. This format would prove popular in the long run, and in March 2003, French community member Yosk would set up the GeneRally World Ranking, where for the next 14 years, every single competition held to these rules would be documented in order to determine who the best players in the world were at any given point during that time frame. However, being a good driver was only half of the game's total appeal. The other half was to make the best circuit possible. Already, as early as October 2002, a member by the name Urashima UPRC proposed a track competition which would be judged by a group of 3 people, rating tracks through various factors such as challenge, visuals, and AI driving ability. This idea evidently caught on, as in July of the following year, the Track of the Month competition, or TOM for short, would be established by L-Wing as a means for the community to vote on what they thought was the best track each month. This was instituted as a means to incentivize track makers to build better tracks, as quality was an issue during the days of the original track database, and its subsequent follow-up on RaceSim Central. The competition went ahead without the blessing of the community as a whole, but it proved popular enough to become one of its biggest mainstays, with Ted Minator's Alpha Racing Motorama the inaugural winner. As its future was uncertain at the time, the artwork for the award would not be created until the following month, with user Druid Riven creating them, which would be used until the award was facelifted in 2005, with Elwing stepping down that year for Georg M to take over, who was then followed by several other organisers including Corey Miller and Marcus Möller, until the award fell under the general control of the GeneRally International Forum in the 2010s. In total, 170 different tracks would have the honour of winning this prestigious award over the course of 13 years, with Polish track maker Maciek 1 winning 23 times between 2008 and 2015, including a double win during the November 2011 contest. The success of Tom would later prompt the community to launch Car of the Month, or COM, in 2010, but it wouldn't really reach the success of its predecessor. For the next half a decade, the game's course was set. Track making continued to advance, with new techniques being developed by all sorts of track makers. In 2005, to celebrate the game's 3rd anniversary, the original Update project was born, where the members of the community were tasked with producing their own takes on updated versions of the game's original cars and tracks. This competition was one of the most interesting ideas ever had by the community, as it allowed authors to provide their own unique takes on the same concepts. Along with Tom, there was also the Joint Effort Track project, where numerous authors would collaborate to produce a single track. Starting in 2003, the project would continue throughout both forums, finishing with its 81st instalment in June 2015. There were many variations on this idea, such as the Amateur Joint Effort project, of which I contributed this part of one of my favourite tracks, Mix City, and the Joint Effort Tree, where various authors provided their own takes on a half-finished course, where I provided the naming scheme for the 3rd of only 4 instalments, with each track being named after a champion rally driver and their co-driver. On the whole, things were going great. Unfortunately, this wasn't to last. During the last 18 months of its original life, RaceSim Central was constantly beset with problems that resulted in the forums being temporarily shut down all throughout the first half of 2009. The forums would resurface throughout the year's closing months, but with the website running low on staff and funds, it could not last for much longer in its present form. On the 27th of December 2009, an era came to a close, with RSCnet announcing that it was shutting down its forums for good, wiping out countless terabytes of mods with minimal warning. Normally, a total loss like this would be devastating to a community. Aside from the plethora of fan websites which were still up, almost every single mod was hosted exclusively on the RSC forums. For any other game, something like this would have been terminal. GeneRally had several things working in its favour that mitigated its downfall. The extremely compact size and simplicity of its mods, with cars being just a handful of kilobytes and tracks falling in the region of 200 to 300 kilobytes at most. This allowed many people to create vast stockpiles of mods which would otherwise have been lost to time. A dedicated community which was already very much used to doing things manually on their own centralised web services, such as Tom and GWR. A direct connection with James Burgess, a key staff member of RaceSim Central and who had in fact conducted the interview with the Rabiner brothers back in 2002. On the same day, RaceSim Central closed its doors for good, what would eventually become the GeneRally International Forum was established, along with a smaller temporary community on Race Department to corral the active members onto. Though there would unfortunately be many unavoidable losses, over the course of the next 10 years, at least 80% of all cars ever publicly released, along with upwards of 90% of all tracks ever publicly released, would be restored, thanks to an extensive and coordinated restoration effort by the community. From its launch at the end of 2009, the new community slowly grew from the ashes of the old one, and the game enjoyed something of a renaissance as new players were introduced and older players returned to the game. In August 2010, James Burgess and Rich Nagel would announce that they secured the rights to develop future versions of GeneRally, after receiving the official blessing of the Rabiner brothers, who transferred ownership of the game on to them. 6 months later, on the 18th of February 2011, GeneRally's first update in more than 7 years released, version 1.10. It was also the most significant update in the game's history, as it marked the game's transition to the SDL library, which allowed for greater compatibility, as well as being the first version of the game with 64-bit operating systems in mind. This was important as Windows 7 was slowly becoming a major part of the home operating system market, and more users were beginning to report incompatibilities and glitches with their computers. The game also supported windowed mode for the very first time, along with additional resolutions for larger monitors. But what was perhaps the biggest change for version 1.10 was the creation and addition of several brand new track objects, which included pedestrian bridges as an alternative to gates, individual people, which allowed for picturesque audiences without the need to resort to 2D map art, invisible walls, and road cones, which actually moved when hit. To demonstrate these new objects, Tuomo H would produce a series of new official tracks using them, which would be bundled with every new release afterwards. Outside of an increase in maximum world size from 200 to 255, and the aforementioned inclusion of new exciting track objects, the time frame had long since passed for any significant fundamental changes to be made to the game's codebase, as to do so would risk incompatibilities with add-ons created for a previous version of the game. The solution was simple. After 10 years, GeneRally needed a sequel. In November 2012, a new blog was set up detailing the results of a 600-player survey which was conducted throughout the community, with James and Marku Hirkas deciding to go ahead with developing a sequel. A campaign was set up on Kickstarter, which although drawing significant interest, only managed to raise £6,000 and ultimately doomed the project to a series of lengthy hiatuses. Though a playable demo was eventually released and small updates were continuously made to the original game all the way through to 2018, GeneRally 2 remains vaporware to the present day. However, there still remains a small ray of hope. In March 2021, the first update in over 3 years was posted, with the development team now comprised of 5 people, proving that Burgess and his team were still committed and were planning to make good on their word, despite being massively behind most people's expectations. The void left by the lack of a GeneRally sequel did not go unnoticed, as L. Harter would announce his own take on a sequel in 2019, named GeneRacing, which would eventually become Gent Racing, likely to avoid confusion between his project and that of the official GeneRally development team. As a whole, GeneRally is perhaps the total package in terms of a casual arcade racer. It perfected the rough formula that Super Sprint and Slicks and Slide had originated and pioneered during the 1980s and 90s, and brought the format into the 21st century, opening itself up to a worldwide audience. Much like Top Gear, the beautiful thing about GeneRally is that its following was entirely organic. The game was released in 2002, long before social media completely took over the internet, by 2 independent Finnish developers who never saw a penny out of their work. Knowledge of the game spread through word of mouth and many online publications that helped to promote it. It created a massive player community thanks to the competition ushered in through the world ranking system. It also created a massive modding community, thanks to its simple cars and tracks and intuitive to use tools. In spite of a website crash which threatened to erase the game's very existence, for over 10 years GeneRally enjoyed a devoted cult following of thousands, which saw the game outlive many other titles within the genre. Even if the sequels are never completed, GeneRally has more than left its mark on the gaming industry. In 2021, Original Fire Games would develop and release their title circuit Superstars, which seems extremely familiar at first glance to anyone familiar with GeneRally, with many people making the immediate connection between the 2 titles. No doubt the developers were heavily influenced by the game. Unfortunately, it seems that the game's best days have long since passed. Partly due to the lack of development on the sequel, partly due to a lack of exposure, and partly due to exhaustion of the community members as a whole with little in the way of new ones, the game is slowly going the way of the dodo. Personally, I hope this game gets one final turn in the limelight before being consigned to the history books. I genuinely believe it to be one of the greatest games ever made and certainly the greatest freeware title ever produced. And the fact it has gone so long without getting any real recognition just boggles the mind. No doubt it holds numerous gaming records, such as the most add-ons for any racing game, the most cars represented in any racing game, and the most real-world tracks represented in any racing game. With tens of thousands of cars and tracks produced, alongside other additions and tweaks, the game is also perhaps in the running as one of the most modded games ever, alongside the likes of Doom and Minecraft. But unlike those games, GeneRally wasn't kept alive by 1 or 2 individuals with deep pockets. It was kept alive through the combined efforts of a community who all worked together to ensure the history of this wonderful game was never lost to time. This video was only possible thanks to my loyal patrons, whose support I am extremely grateful for, as it has allowed me to produce this video among many others, which before wouldn't have been feasible. Thanks very much to everyone who has donated so far and for sticking with me during this unforeseen period of extended relative inactivity. I apologise for acting so privately in the past and hope I can begin to take more of an active role in the coming months. With the world in the current position that it's in, I honestly do not see myself being able to gain any sort of meaningful employment, and I would like to be able to subsist off these videos so that I can make more, increase my production budget, and with enough support bring my efforts into the real world so that I may broaden my subject matter and appeal to a wider audience. Currently, fan donations have been able to support my living costs for around half the year, and I have been able to upgrade my hardware so that I can render videos more effectively. However, there's still a lot more work which needs to be done. Please consider supporting me so I may continue my endeavours, and I'll see you all on the next video.